Hi everyone! We continue ranking all Harry Potter games, like always with the help of my Stasicritic scoring system, which you can read about in the pinned comment. The Harry Potter license has managed to go through a wide spectrum of quality already, from really flawed but charming games to some really great experiences to more conflicting titles. But regardless of how flawed a game would be, what always remained is a consistent direction for the franchise. Well, with Goblet of Fire, things would change, and in this video we will see how. First, I need to make sure it is clear that whatever criticisms I have about this game, or any for that matter, are not aimed at the developers from EA UK. Game development can be so chaotic, especially that of a licensed title, so I do not have the intention of questioning anybody's competence. Everything I say about the game strictly concerns the final product. It would be easy to assume that I would start with criticizing the quite drastic directional shift of the game into a more action-oriented one in comparison to previous titles. But a change in direction doesn't automatically mean a game's quality is going to be bad. I do think that Goblet of Fire would benefit from the older structure, but that's not the problem. Goblet of Fire spreads itself too thin and doesn't properly focus on anything. It's an action game and yet its combat is basic. The multitude of spells is automatically selected based on context you don't always have full control of, and the variety of enemies is pretty small. The game is built upon exploration of levels, and yet it keeps throwing you out of those levels as soon as you find one of the main goals, not letting you explore more without going through the process of getting back into the mission again. It introduces co-op play with AI or human companions and some combos that you can do together, but it never goes deeper than one person is stunning an enemy while another is damaging them somehow. Goblet of Fire has puzzles, but they're all pretty simple and none utilize the co-op component beyond the fact that to interact with some objects you need all players to cast a spell at once. And even though the game is mostly based on cooperative play, the most exciting levels are single player only. There is no foundation to stand on, and this is magnified by a lack of proper implementation. Controlling your character feels like you're driving a car. Targeting prioritizes only direction, not distance and height. As a result, your spells will very often hit not the enemies you want. As mentioned, spells are mostly contextual and depend on the enemy and their state. Considering allies are changing states of enemies on their own, you might not cast what you'd expect, which is a particular problem for challenge missions. Try to be fancy and drop a rock on an enemy? Good luck with properly targeting the rock and moving it into position with its physics-based levitation while you're vulnerable to attacks. Also, if you want to upgrade your characters, have fun trying to collect beans that keep running away from you unless you cast Accio, which has a big delay after you stop casting when you're left vulnerable and unable to use other spells. And even though Goblet of Fire plays like a linear action game that's divided into a number of levels, it is structured like an open-world experience. To beat the game, you need to complete all the Triwizard Tournament challenges. To access these challenges, you need to collect the Triwizard Shields, and these shields you will find in levels, all of which have multiple exploration paths. But not all paths are accessible from the get-go, some open up after a certain completion ratio and some require a spell you will get access to later. Of course, there are games where you need to go through the same levels multiple times, but usually that comes with some changes or differentiation. In Goblet of Fire, you have to complete the same segments over and over again, because when you find one shield, the game will take you out of the level automatically, even if there's another nearby. So you're redoing a bunch of the same locations to unlock one of the set pieces, which are probably the best parts of the game, mostly due to the visual spectacle of it, but also because they actually play alright. There is not much Goblet of Fire has in other departments to counteract the poor gameplay. Story is practically non-existent, it is a collection of movie-based events that's barely connected by any threads. The visual design style has changed to one that's recreating actual faces of movie actors, and in the case of Voldemort, having the actor also reprise the role. But that being said, Goblet of Fire is a game that looks good either when static or from afar, as when the camera is up close, the characters look weird and don't have any lip sync to boot. Even the music, which in previous games enhanced the magical atmosphere, in this one is mostly boring and monotone, with the exception of the main theme. At least, this is the last time a rapist composes for the franchise. Look, I know I touched upon this a lot, but I believe reiteration is important in this case, as too many people tolerate sexual assault too easily, even when it concerns a person that not only was scamming his fans on multiple occasions, but in general is full of red flags that put a stop on him getting regularly hired long before the public calling out. Of course, this doesn't influence the discussion of the game's quality, which, well, in my Statocritic system, is going to be represented through a score of 20. To be absolutely fair, in co-op sessions Goblet of Fire can still be pretty fun, if only because human interaction elevates poor and chaotic design into something enjoyable. Goblet of Fire for PSP is almost identical to the console one. There are some additional minigames that largely don't matter, however this entry is separate because there is one level less. Adding a game focused so much on replaying levels that changes the experience quite a bit. Granted, not enough to change the Statocritic rating of 20, but also it's more tolerable, so it will get a higher position in the list. Goblet of Fire for GBA was developed by Magic Pockets, and it tries to follow the style of the console game in the sense that it's more of a linear action title with some set-piece levels in between. And also it recreates the way the story was told in the big version, as in, barely. One big plus from the get-go is that Triwizard Shields are not required for progression, they're optional collectibles, so your flow through the campaign is going to be much smoother. And in general the gameplay is much more bearable, though still really clunky. Target assist is wonky, sometimes you can even miss enemies at a point-blank range, your AI can just stand still in fights and not do anything, and a bunch of stuff like that. The game also tends to overuse the interesting ideas it has. For example, the red cap enemy design is actually pretty neat. They go out with their drawers when your back is turned and run back when you look at them, so you have to sort of time when to turn around to be able to catch them and throw into a cauldron. That's... actually, now that I say it out loud, that's horrifying! Do we cook those red caps? At any rate, it's a nice enemy that serves as a good pace breaker. But the game can't resist putting about 10 of them in a single room, and then it becomes a chore. Still, it's undeniable that the handheld Goblet of Fire is a much more holistic game than its console brother. It's a very traditional, linear top-down action-adventure with some explorable protruding secret and not-so-secret paths for collectibles, and as you gain more spells, you have access to an increasing amount of areas in the levels. So at least it's more enjoyable from that perspective, and replaying levels is something that you do out of your own accord rather than being forced to complete the game. That being said, since Goblet of Fire for GBA is still pretty problematic, it's going to get a Statocritic rating of 38. Disappointing, but playable and potentially enjoyable if you can look past its flaws. At the first glance, the separation of the Nintendo DS port into a different entry may feel weird. It looks exactly like the GBA title, just with UI being placed on a separate screen. But this being a game for DS, of course there's touchscreen minigames, and some of them are just a bonus that can be accessed outside of the main campaign, like taking care of a Niffler in something that looks like a Tamagotchi but is much more linear in nature. As a side note, it's pretty wild to see a depiction of a Niffler from before the Fantastic Beasts movie has popularized its current design. What really makes this version a different experience are the progression blocking duel and minigames added to the main campaign itself. And those are pretty bad, transforming what was a fine enough if flawed set of missions into something infuriating. It might seem like a little addition, but it changes the feel of the entire game. This is why the DS version gets a Stasocritic rating of 23. If you really want to take care of a Niffler, you can get the game for DS. But if your main interest is in the main campaign, it's best to go for the better flowing GBA version than this one. The Goblet of Fire games weren't particularly great. It's a shame. While I did say that I won't criticize the change direction itself, I think if there wouldn't have been a drastic shift, the teams would be able to make something much more reasonable in a year based on already existing gameplay. As it is now though, in this era Harry Potter games are definitely at their lowest, broadly speaking, and in the next video we shall see if Order of the Phoenix will be able to get the franchise back on track.
Wingardium Leviosa!
Oops. Sorry. Look, it's not my fault you're standing in the path of the objects I'm levitating.